Tell me when it's up. For folks who are just tuning in on Ustream, we just started talking about Sam Harris, the big fat Islamophobe. What is that, man? Is that because they're brown? Is that because people are trying to be like super
Yeah,
progressive? Is that
it's what?
whoops?
Yeah, it's a very dangerous irony and double standard. It's
Yeah.
really it's one of the most disturbing phenomenon I think to be found on the landscape now. It's a
For folks tuning in on Ustream, just to keep you up to date, we were talking about how you can make fun of Christianity with no problems whatsoever. Make fun of Mormonism, nobody cares. But if you make fun of Islam, progressive people will call you Islamophobic.
yeah, it's a combination of very understandable fears of racism
Yes.
and xenophobia. So we have this. We're obviously trailing a legacy that we should be mortified by. This a legacy of slavery and colonialism and all of that is something we should have a critical distance from and not want to recapitulate in any form. And so it's important to be mindful of that, obviously. But there's this combination of white guilt and political correctness and just sheer Stockholm syndrome in some people that has made it impossible to criticize Islam without being branded a racist. And Islam, traditional, if you're not going to buy traditional, then conservative. If you're not going to buy conservative, then extremist. There's some version of Islam that is the most odious ideology operative now. It is leading directly to the immiseration of millions of people. And the moment you try to really draw a straight line, and myriad straight lines exist between that phenomenon and the actual doctrine of Islam, the actual idea set handed down from Muhammad, you're accused of bigotry, and you're put right next to Michelle Bachmann and anyone else on the right who obviously you can't ally with in any sense. So it's very troubling because you have those whole websites and magazines like Salon and Alternate and even The Nation that just reflexively demonize anyone who has said anything about Islam, the religion, that's negative. And it's a double standard we're going to have to overcome.
Salon goes hard.
Mm-hmm.
They go hard with the
Yeah.
progressive silliness. I mean, they got mad at Patton Oswalt for making a joke about someone making a joke about Chinese accents. Like,
Right.
it was so stupid. It
Yeah.
made them look so petty, pedantic, and silly. It's just like, what are you guys doing? Like, there's a lot of, like, real issues going on in the world. There's a lot of real things to think about in this day and age.
Yeah, no, I wrote a blog post about Malala Yousafzai, the 16-year-old girl who was at 15 shot by the Taliban and was up for the Nobel Prize, which she didn't win, but should have. And my blog post was totally praiseworthy of her. I said she's the best thing to come out of the Muslim world in 1,000 years. She should have won the Nobel Prize. She's elegant, eloquent, and brave. And the headline in Salon was Sam Harris slurs Malala.
Wow.
And my slur was not basically accepting her view of Islam as the canonical Islam, because she's not an atheist, and they thought I was sort of co-opting her as an atheist, which I obviously wasn't doing. So it's incredibly frustrating because so many smart people or otherwise smart people are taken in by this because people really want to believe that all religions are the same and that people everywhere are the same and want the same things. And if we just got our act together on the world stage, if we just cease to exploit people and we cease to be selfish and we just pulled back all the drones, everyone would behave the same way. We would have rational actors everywhere. And there's just no evidence for that. And there's just as much evidence as you could possibly want to find for the antithesis, which is there are some people who are in a death cult who are certain of paradise and very eager to get there. And there's no talking to them. And then there's a much vaster number of people around them who support them, who are not jihadists, but who are basically aligned with them in terms of their worldview. So, we have to win a war of ideas, and we have to win a war, and we have to be honest about it.
Yeah, we certainly do. And there's this weird thing going on right now in Saudi Arabia where women are protesting the right to drive. They're all driving.
Mm.
And this is a big issue. And it's crazy that in
Yeah.
2013, and that is directly related to religion.
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's incredibly edgy and risky to do. It's just amazing to get, if you're a woman, to get behind the wheel of a car in Saudi Arabia is a life disorienting risk. You know, to make that kind of social protest. I mean, so if at best they're behind us by whatever 50 years, 75 years in certain social epiphanies. You know, so if you roll back the clock in the U.S. and look at racism, we don't really have the same analogous religious brainwashing. But if you look at racism in the U.S., I mean, what was going on in the teens and 20s and 30s is just unthinkable now. I mean, just lynchings and newspaper editorials that were starkly racist. I mean, there are newspaper editorials, not op-eds, but actually the editorial of the New York Times and the LA Times in 1910, 1915, that read exactly like a KKK pamphlet. Wow. I mean, just mind-boggling. So wow. At the very least, we have societies that have to catch up in their attitudes towards women and homosexuals and pluralism and atheism, and we have to facilitate that process by not caving in when free speech issues come up. So when someone draws a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad and people start burning embassies, the move on our side can't be to apologize for cartooning and to become self-critical and masochistic about, you know, why is it that we had these cartoonists that did this terrible thing, and that's essentially what we did, and we pulled no magazine, with the exception of one, Free Inquiry, in the U.S. published those cartoons. They were totally benign cartoons. You probably saw them. Yeah. They're available online, but we practice self-censorship to a degree that is just astonishing and really just harmful to this this conflict, both the hot and cold conflict that we're having.
It's caricature. It's like a caricature of overblown reaction that you get from someone that maybe is put in a situation where they want to always use this as an excuse for why things are. Like, it's racism, man. This is racism. Or you just hate women. Like, there's a bunch of these. Like, oh, you're Islamophobic. It's like, boom, they throw that on you, this wet blanket. And it's a weird thing because you call it a cult, and I agree with you, but that's a very controversial thing to say. If you say that, people get very upset with you. But the reality is, somebody's in a cult, okay? If you got 20 different, whatever, how many different religions that are practiced worldwide? I don't know how many. How many are there?
Well, probably hundreds, but there's
the big three.
A handful of main ones we care about. But
yeah, the main ones we care about. Yeah. Okay, let's just say there's only 4. Someone's in a cult. Someone's lying.
Right.
They have 4 different stories. So what's going on? Who's telling the truth? Someone's in a cult. Yeah. And no one's willing to admit that of course, everyone believes the other people are in a cult, but just the cognitive dissonance involved in picking some ancient ideology and thinking that at some point in time somebody actually had a conversation with the divine, wrote it down verbatim, it is perfect, and it's never been touched by the hand of man or distorted. It's weird that you get that from something like Salon. And that's essentially what they're doing by calling you Islamophobic.
Yeah,
they're endorsing this idea that this wacky cult that makes you kill people if they draw a picture of their guy. Women aren't allowed to drive cars. Suicide bombing in this day and age is like very, very common and religious based. And sure, that's the most extreme faction of that religion. And there's many people that are moderate Muslims who despise that as much as we do. But still, it's an ideology, and ideologies are real problems.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the dispute is that the link that I'm drawing and that many other people draw between that behavior and the religion is being challenged. So the people who would brand me as an Islamophobe would say that this behavior has nothing to do with Islam in principle. It's that one, you have extremists in every religion, and they all misbehave. or bad people will do bad things anyway, and religion is always a pretext. And that is just not true. The scary phenomenon, I think the most scary phenomenon really to be witnessed anywhere, is that you can have psychologically healthy, rational, otherwise competent and capable and charismatic people who have other opportunities in life. You know, the quarterback of the football team can become a jihadist given the right ideas. And if you just admit to yourself that certain people actually believe in paradise and believe that there's a specific way to get there that entails violent defense of the faith, then it becomes totally rational to behave this way. Then you and I would be flying planes into buildings if we actually believe this. It doesn't matter what other opportunities you have in life. And the thing that most secular liberals can't get their minds around is that people actually believe in paradise. People actually believe that a certain book was dictated by the creator of the universe, and it has provided a blueprint and a moral framework that many, many people, millions of people, believe is perfect and unchallengeable for all time. And then once you admit that, you just have to look at the blueprint. And this particular blueprint says a lot about a holy war and fighting the infidel and subjugating the infidel and killing apostates. So you know, if you convert to Islam now on this show, and then by the end of the show say, I thought better of it, I don't feel like being a Muslim anymore, I'm unconverting, that is a crime punishable by death. And that's not extremist Islam. That's not, I was in a training camp in Afghanistan with 10,000 other lunatics Islam. That is plain vanilla Islam. Now, you can sort of dicker around the edges of that dogma by saying,
"You're dead to me."
Or no, you can't go that far, unfortunately.
Not dead, but you're dead to me.
You can say, well, the person has to speak out against the faith, or repeatedly. He has to be an obnoxious apostate. But what you don't get are millions and millions of Muslims who belong to some bona fide tradition of Islam, who say, "Oh no, apostasy is fine. You should be free to change your mind about the faith." And we don't care if you were once a Muslim and now you become a Hindu, or you were once a Muslim and now you become a Christian or an atheist. That is fine with us. If that existed, well, then you could just point to that brand of Islam and say, well, go over there, guys. That's the Islam we should be encouraging. But we have to, and clearly we have to figure out some way to massage the faith into conformity with that kind of pluralism and secularism. But it's just not there, and for magazines like Salon to pretend that killing apostates has no connection to the real religion of Islam is just pure delusion, and it's a dangerous one.
It's also dangerous just to have a very strict ideology, to have a thing that not just you're supposed to do because the culture wants you to do it, but because God wants you to. That's weird. Yeah. It's dumb. It's weird. It's insane. If you think that in 2013, with the kind of access to information we have, that we really believe that someone actually wrote this stuff down from the divine, it's craziness. It's with Christianity, whether it's Mormonism. Mormonism is hilarious. Mormonism and Scientology are my two favorites because we know the guy who made them.
Right.
You know, those are,
and we know they were the con men.
Well, not just con men.
We know way too much about them.
Yeah, I mean, L. Ron Hubbard was a fucking science fiction author. He made a science fiction religion. I mean, it's really beautiful. In a way, it's hilariously beautiful. And someone like me who appreciates the folly of life, I can appreciate that in a big way. I mean, it's like endless comedy. It's just so stupid.
Yeah.
What is it though? Why do we need something? But why does everybody need something?
But it's crucial that you acknowledge the difference between the various ideologies on offer, because believing that your worldview has come from God is not necessarily a deal breaker in terms of living in a global civil society if that worldview prescribes lots of benign things. I mean, so if you think God told you to be a vegetarian and never harm anyone and learn everything you can about science and mathematics and economics and become a really energetic contributor to civil society. If that's your religion, well then you're never going to show up on anyone's radar as a dangerous person. It's just the main religions on offer don't have that kind of those kinds of ideas, and they have first century and Iron Age platitudes and strictures that have now been canonized in these books, and there's no way to rewrite the books. You can't edit the books. I mean, people effectively edit the books by ignoring the most barbarous stuff in there, but there's no way to say we as Muslims or as Christians are going to craft a new scripture that's in line with all that we've come to learn about the universe, and follow that as though it were the Word of God, because they would know they were making it up, and that's that's not satisfying.
Christians are funny because they ignore things conveniently. Like, I've met so many Christians that have Christian Bible quote tattoos. Like,
right.
Did you read that thing? You're not supposed to do that.
Right.
Like, you're not even supposed to write on yourself. You're not even supposed to use a magic marker. And here you are getting a tattoo of a Bible quote. That's like, God's like, Jesus Christ, did you pay attention to what I said?
Well, it's a long book. It's a long book. Unfortunately, the Quran is not as long a book. You can read the Quran in a weekend. It's a much shorter book. You read the Bible cover to cover, it takes you a month and a half. But you read the Quran, it's a much more unified document, and you can't cherry pick it. You can cherry pick it a little bit, but you can't cherry pick it in quite the same way. You can't just take Jesus and half his moods the way you can as a Christian and say, well, it's all about turning the other cheek, and I don't care about hell, and I don't care about any of these culture war issues. You really can't do that with Islam, and that's why this fusion of the religion and the politics is so difficult to break, because it's explicit, and there's no render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's in the Quran as there is in the Bible. So
my favorite religion is Mormons. They're the nicest people.
Yeah.
They're so sweet.
Yeah.
Like, every time I've had a Mormon neighbor or, meet Mormons, they're the nicest people. They're almost like childlike in their belief, like childlike in their approach to religion. Like, my wife has a friend who's a Mormon. I went out to dinner with her and her husband, and somewhere along the line, the subject of higher power came up, and she was grilling me like, do you believe in a higher power? And, basically I said, well, I don't not believe. I don't know. I mean, who the fuck knows? And she's like, you don't know. If you don't know, how do you sleep at night?
Right.
Like, for her, like, someone had to tell her so she could tuck herself into bed like a little kid, like my 5-year-old. Like, sweetie, God's watching over you and everything's going to be okay. Okay. Like, now I can go to sleep.
Yeah.
For her, it was very child. She's a fucking 40-year-old woman. Like, she had this childlike, narrow tunnel of thinking that she prescribed to.
Ex-Mormons are awesome because there's no group of people that are more energetic in their atheism that I've met than ex-Mormons, because they're coming out of this thing that is just so obviously made up. I mean, it's like you get Joseph Smith as a douser and a con man, and
14,
and just getting it on with everyone's wife, and making up principles. He gets new revelations to appease his jealous wife. He goes into the closet, and God tells him that he's got to have more hot girls. So it's just there in the floodlights of history to be inspected. And so once they get out of it and they see just that they're trailing all this nonsense, they're very fun to talk to.
What is it about people that we need, or some people need that? They need that. They need an ideology. They need a framework. They need a scaffolding to live their life on. They can't just freeball it. They can't just go, who knows, let's just figure out what we already know and apply that to wonder. They can't do that. They need an answer.
Well, I wouldn't be the first to observe that death has something to do with it. This anxiety about what it all means in light of the fact that it all apparently ends is really a defense against grief. These beliefs, a belief in paradise, is really the only thing you can tell yourself or tell another person or tell your child in the presence of death that makes death fundamentally unproblematic. I mean, so you're the closest person to you in your life has died, or your child has died, And so what are you going to say to yourself or to the people around you, or what can they say to you that is just not only takes the sting out slightly, but it's just perfectly consoling, if you could believe it. It's this proposition that you're going to meet again in some perfect place, and you're going to spend eternity there, and be perfectly happy. And all you have to do is believe the right things in the meantime, and not screw up too badly as a homosexual or whatever else is on the checklist of don'ts, and you will get there, and you'll be reunited with everyone you care about. And that is, there is no secular or atheist or rational alternative to that. And I mean, that's a bullet I think we just have to bite. It's just there's no, at the graveside of a child, the atheist doesn't have something to say that says this is not a problem. This is, your tears are wasted. And Christians and Muslims and Mormons and basically everyone who posits a heaven that is assured based on the right beliefs, they do have something to say that the crowd buys into, and there's no question that it relieves that suffering. Now, I think it comes with a host of other problems that even that trade-off is not worth it. I mean, even if we grant that a certain kind of suffering is relieved there's other kinds of suffering that spring up. I mean, people are not learning how to grieve. They're not learning how to teach their children to grieve. They're not learning intellectual honesty. They're not, and they're mired in a way of thinking that is causing them constantly to collide with reality in unfortunate ways that they actually don't get what they want in life. Because they're believing things that just don't line up with how the world works, and so I think it is. If you look closely, you can see that even that, the best thing. I mean, the baby in the bathwater of faith is still dysfunctional.
The Mormon friend, she applied for a real estate license and didn't get it. She failed the test, and she was upset. She's like, "I'm a good person. Why didn't I get it? I'm doing all the right things, and I'm a good person." Like, that's what she kept saying. It's like being around a crazy person.
Yeah.
Like, she just believes that if you do God's word, good things are going to happen to you. I'm a good person. Why didn't I get this?
Right.
Meanwhile, not looking at the fact that she's rich as fuck, lives in a great house, has healthy kids. Like, there's all this wonderful stuff going on in your life. Like, maybe you just didn't apply yourself enough to this whole real estate thing. So it's nothing to do with God failing you.
Right. Right.
Do you think that religion is something that's allowing human beings to make this jump from animals to enlightened, connected beings? It seems to me that with the connection that we're enjoying through technology, through the internet, and through the access of information, it seems to me that we're slowly but surely dissolving all the boundaries between people and information. And we're going to have much more truth about life and death and the very origins of the universe in 100 years or 1,000 years than we had 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And I always wonder if, like, religion is something that just allowed us to keep our shit together just long enough for some really fucking smart dudes to figure out the internet. Keep our shit together, just like keep together morally, give these fucking crazy apes some sort of an excuse or a reason to live, and so they don't just go marauding and jump off cliffs out of despair, and give them something that allows them to continue the work, and that work being society ultimately moving towards some sort of technological innovation 0 point. Like everything we do, whether it's cell phones or laptops or cars, every year it's better. No one ever goes, we're good. This cell phone I have, this Galaxy Note, no one's ever going to look at this and go, this thing's perfect. Okay, we're done. We don't ever have to make another cell phone again. We're going to continue to move forward, faster speeds, more connections, more apps, more things that they can do, holograms, time travel, whatever the fuck it's going to be. We're never going to stop. And it almost, sometimes I wonder if what religion is just like some sort of a scaffolding that lets us build society on.
Yeah, I actually don't view it that way. I think there are people who think that religion paid evolutionary dividends because it allowed large groups of people, large groups of kind of dimly related people, not just family, but larger tribes, to cohere in a way that they couldn't otherwise. So the way to get a bunch of strangers to cohere is to put a big idol in the corner and say, anyone who trespasses the god is going to be killed, and we're going to commit a sacrifice of a few kids, every month or so, and keep everyone in line, and and outsiders who come into our world who don't understand our taboos and our precepts are going to be easily recognizable as outsiders. And so there's a long list of things that people think religion may have given our ancestors. That may be true. I happen to think that religion, most of what explains religion, is just more fundamental cognitive and emotional mechanisms that have nothing in principle to do with religion, and which have also given us science and reason and everything else that is recognizable as human cognition. So I think the most rudimentary piece here is belief formation. You and I and every other human being who is neurologically intact comes into this world equipped to represent reality in language and to trade in those representations and to give them credence to one or another degree. So you tell me where this studio is, I believe you. It's just language, right? And the language got me here. My belief in the language got me here. If I thought that I had transcribed the address wrong, that belief would have caused me to call you and make sure I got the. So I mean, these are all just ones and zeros in our computer at the moment. But virtually the totality of our worldview is linguistically mediated in this way. Everything is not a matter of direct sensory perception in each moment. So religion is just part of that. It's the set of beliefs people form for which they have very loose evidentiary criteria and which govern all these no-go areas for science. What happens after death? What is the meaning of life? What's the most important thing to live for? And now I think actually reason can capture all of those conversations as well, and it is in the process of doing it. But it really is just a matter of believing certain propositions and the rules by which we vet those beliefs when we are in conversation with one another. And the problem with faith is that it really operates as the permission people give one another to believe things strongly without evidence. And we don't give that permission in any other area of our lives. We don't give that permission in science. We don't give it in politics, insofar as we're practicing politics that anyone can tolerate. And it's that permission, the taboo around criticizing that faith is something we're hopefully getting over. We're going to have to get over it because it is the reason why people oppose gay marriage. It is the reason why people want laws that make blasphemy a criminal offense. And so that's it's just insofar as you actually believe something, it can't help but show up in the public sphere. I mean, people think beliefs are private. They're not. They're only private if there's nothing in your life or in the environment that is calling them out. But the moment that they are relevant to your behavior, they can't help but inform your behavior insofar as you actually believe them. And that's it's just. I mean, this is an example I gave in one of my books, but it's like a belief, a true belief in the efficacy of prayer is dangerous if insofar as you really believe it, you're going to be tempted to rely on prayer. You're going to be tempted to rely on prayer for your children. You've got these people who won't take their children to doctors because they think prayer is going to work. Imagine if you had a pilot who's trying to land the plane with prayer. I mean, it's clear that, I mean, it's a ridiculous example because we think no one would ever do that. But in some sense, people do that in situations where the stakes are just as high. And certainly everyone who's waging jihad thinks that their belief in paradise is true, and it's the credence they give to that real, just pure language in the mind that is so dangerous.
Did religion did religion ever play an important function in society? Did it ever allow people to get past the barbarian ways and apply some sort of moral and ethical rules to society? Did it ever have any function or any positive benefit that maybe wouldn't have come about if people were just a bunch of savage tribal people?
Well, yeah, you can say that it did, but see, I mean, I look at it from the other side. So for instance, when you say that when you look at all the good things Christians have done under the aegis of Christianity, occasionally you can point to something in the doctrine of Christianity that seems to be the operative variable. So that, like, if that doctrine were different, behavior would be different. But for the most part, what you see is just people being people, trying to get what they want out of life. They're building bridges, and they're learning about disease, and they're trying to develop scientific principles, and it just so happens they're all Christians doing this, and Christianity doesn't really get credit for the birth of science. It shouldn't get credit for the birth of science. It shouldn't get credit for all the bridges we built or the roads we paved. It's just there was no one else to do the job in Europe. You know, this was everyone was a Christian. Everyone came into this world and was indoctrinated into a worldview that they got on mother's knee, and there was no other worldview on offer. So, I mean, it's just as true to say that virtually everyone who ever fought a war or saved a life or built a bridge did it in complete ignorance of Darwinian evolution, right? That doesn't mean that ignorance of Darwinian evolution was the crucial variable there, or is a good thing, or is something we should want to promote, or something we should safeguard. It just so happens that prior to 1859, this notion of evolution was not it was not an idea that had appeared in anyone's head, and so there was no alternative but to not know anything about evolution. Now we could have gotten, if you could draw a line from the ancient Greece and give us a civilization with a very rich dialogue about ethics and about social norms that would not have needed to invoke the war god of Abraham. I mean, so, like Plato could have given us the basis to think rationally about the good life, and Plato and everyone like him in ancient Greece, and that is a stream of ideas that is unencumbered by this notion of maybe there's an invisible monster out in the desert who wants a human sacrifice from time to time, and maybe had a son who died for our sins. So I don't think it's actually, even if religion has seemed to do it in certain circumstances, I don't think it was actually a necessary piece. I think we are so deeply wired as social creatures to care about ethics that ethics was going to show up anyway. So Christian ethics was not just Christian and Jewish and Muslim ethics were not a necessary scaffold for us.
But there's also examples of dehumanization of the other, really common examples. The way societies are allowed to look at their enemy as not being human and commit horrible atrocities because of that. There's a ton of examples of that.
Well, that's our default.
Yes.
Our default is the guys over in the next valley, we don't know them. I mean, so chimps have that, right? So chimps will band together in war parties and kill other chimps who are not part of their tribe if they happen to outnumber them, and that is a behavior that clearly, tribalistic, xenophobic violence is clearly something we are good at and do reflexively in a state of nature. So yeah, I mean that's where we start. So we overcome that by extending the circle of our morality and extending our relationships with our economic relationships, our cultural relationships, our peaceful collaboration with strangers. I mean that's what civilization is. Civilization is a machine to get us to peacefully collaborate with strangers. And the frontal cortex of every human brain is a machine that allows for that collaboration. And if you damage that in an individual, you get I mean, there's many different pathologies there, but one is psychopathy. I mean, if you have the right damage to your brain, you are someone who sees no basis for collaboration. You don't feel empathy for other people. You either don't care that you make them suffer, or you actually take sadistic pleasure in making them suffer, and the very basis for trust breaks down in relation to such a person. And what I would argue is that there are actually cultures that are, for all intents and purposes, psychopathic. In which you can put perfectly normal individuals, people who are neurologically intact, who don't have any of the anatomical problems of psychopaths, but put them into a system of poorly aligned incentives and bad ideas, and they essentially act like psychopaths. The guy who got on the bus and shot Malala in the head for wanting to go to school, I mean, that's essentially what happened. The Taliban, a Taliban gunman, tried to assassinate a 15-year-old girl for the crime of wanting to get an education. Most people look at that and think, well, he must have been a psychopath, or he must have been crazy. And I think the situation we're in is far more sinister than that. He very likely was a perfectly normal person, and very likely a father, who thought he was doing a good thing, and in every other moment in his life, is probably a nice guy, probably a compassionate guy, probably a guy who's capable
That's
of
a
empathy.
weird jump. Why would you think that?
Well, because you just have to look at the kinds of atrocities that normal people perpetrate in mass movements that are, for want of a better word, evil. So look at Nazi Germany. How did the Holocaust occur? It was not that there were hundreds of thousands of psychopaths eager to collaborate in the destruction of a people. There were a lot of normal people who, given the requisite ideas and the requisite incentives, and the ability, as you described, to dehumanize the other, just saw no problem. I mean, they could burn people in gas chambers by day and go home and shed a tear over Wagner at night and play with their own kids. And that disjunction morally never had to be inspected. Now, obviously, there are some people who were racked by guilt and some people who refused to collaborate, but I mean, this is one of the scary features of the human mind. It's possible to be an otherwise good person and do horrible things in the right situation. That's not to say that there aren't psychopaths who are evil and essentially monsters, but normal people are capable of terrible things. And in the context of certain religious ideas, I think it becomes quite rational for them to perpetrate evil.
I agree with you, but I don't think there's any evidence that this guy was like a normal, nice guy in everyday life. And I just don't understand why you would assume he was. I'd always assumed that if everyone knew that she was going to school and there were so many people that knew, it would take an extreme version of that ideology in order to get on a bus and shoot a 15-year-old girl, essentially a little kid.
Well, let me just say, I know nothing about this particular person.
Right.
I'm just guessing. But I think there's no reason to believe that every member of the Taliban or every member of Al-Qaeda is a psychopath or is a person who would otherwise do terrible things to innocent strangers. There's no reason to believe that, and there are many reasons to believe otherwise. And you can just look at how people get radicalized, and it's not. You don't have to round up all the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world and brainwash them and turn them loose. They're far more functional people than that.
Isn't that what we do when we train troops?
Well, we do it. I mean, you can even go into a more um, in a stranger direction than that. When you look at what a surgeon has to do just to cut into a human body, there's a kind of desensitization and a shutting down of empathy, the kind of normal circuits of empathy and compassion to do that. So you and I, in the presence of the suffering we would see in an ER, say, would probably be physiologically and emotionally really amped up because we're not used to it, and we can't. We see someone in tears with a major wound or a broken arm, and all of our empathy circuits kick in, and we're not very useful in that circumstance. I mean, leave aside for the moment that we actually don't know what to do. Even if we did know what to do, an efflux of empathy in that moment is not especially useful. And to be a great, trauma surgeon, you want to be somebody who is not distracted by the tears and the obvious signs of human suffering, and who can just deal with this like a machine that has to be fixed. And there's even a point of contact between that ability just to kind of shut out the other human stuff and deal with the machine that is on a continuum with this cognitive emotional gesture of dehumanizing the other, and just seeing no moral implication in just blowing up bodies.
I see what you're saying. So it's essentially you're talking about a broad spectrum of possibilities of the way the mind operates. And there's some people that can learn how to shut things off. And that's what you're doing when you're a soldier. You just learn how to, this is your new reality. There was an article recently where they interviewed that guy who was a soldier who got in trouble because he was urinating on a dead insurgent.
Mm-hmm.
And they interviewed him. And it was really interesting because he was very honest about how he felt about the situation. He said that people have this idea of what they want out of a Marine. They want a guy who's on the commercial, who slides the sword into the holster or the scabbard and stands up straight and is wearing a perfectly trimmed suit. And you don't want a guy who's going to piss on a dead guy.
Right.
But you don't get one without the other. You don't get a killer. You don't get a guy who doesn't have total disdain for the enemy. I mean, that's what develops. You see your friends die. You see those around you die. You see these people shoot at you. You develop total disdain. That it's okay to kill people, but it's not okay to pee on them. It gets real weird. And I'm not saying that it's okay to pee on people. I'm certainly not saying that it's okay to kill people either. But I'm saying it is weird that we get mad at one and not the other. It's almost like there's a thing about sexuality that's I always found really odd. You can't watch sex, but you can watch graphic violence. You can put a movie, and if it's sex, it's everything. There's legs covering, there's angles, and you don't ever see genitals, except it's very brief, and there's no actual intercourse. We're not allowed to show intercourse. Intercourse is somehow or another ridiculously taboo. But we can watch people's heads explode on regular television. The Walking Dead is just, every episode is just boom, slash, fucking swords cut heads off, and guns blow people up, and we're weird.
Yeah, yeah.